You're here for Season 7 of the Whole Horse Podcast, now at 110 episodes and counting. I'm your host, Elisse Miki, coming to you from Vancouver Island in Canada. I can't wait to continue to share thought-provoking, edge-pushing, geeky, and often challenging conversations with horse professionals from all areas of our industry who are working to make horses' lives better. This season, you can look forward to deep dives into equine bodywork and cranial work with my friend and colleague, Elisse Miki, and much more on the specifics of creating enriching, healthy horse spaces, an area I'm particularly passionate about. I'm so excited that you're here listening in, meeting great horsey humans, and hopefully learning a new thing or two about horses and yourself. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. You're here for the Whole Horse Podcast, and it's Alexa, and I'm here today with a very special announcement because Elisse Miki and I are experimenting with the idea of building our own podcast one day about all things wonderfully geeky, anatomy rich, physiology, dense. And we want to test it out here on the Whole Horse Podcast. So we're going to bring you 4 different podcasts this year in a series. And today is the first one. So aren't you in luck? Welcome, Elisse.
Hey, Alexa. Thanks for having me back. As always, a major pleasure.
Yeah, so glad that you're here. So for anyone that doesn't know Elisse, you should go back and listen to all of the wonderful podcasts that we've had together. And Elisse is my partner in all things geeky. We together teach a equine cranial certification and have done all sorts of wonderful things over the last 4 or 5 years together. And this is just kind of the next piece of the puzzle here today. So we wanted today to focus in on one of our passions, which is, of course, cranial therapy. We've done one podcast before. If you haven't listened to it, we recommend going back, checking it out. Can't remember what episode, but you can find it. And we want to expand on it today and get more deeply into some of these pieces, why cranial work is important, how it works on a physiological level, and just really get into a geek out around it. So let's get going. All right. You ready, Elisse?
I'm ready.
Elisse is the most wonderfully geeky person I know, and she's so smart, and I want her brain. So we're excited to team up today here. And our focus today, we're going to talk some about senior horse care. So for any of you who have horses that are, let's say 18, 19 plus, and are wondering how to care for them and understand their bodies and the process of, let's not call it aging, but becoming an elder in a good way. We want to talk about that today. And we also really are focusing here on, you don't have to be a body worker, but this is going to be a great podcast. We hope for those of you who are body workers to start to understand some of the ways that the cranial work can actually integrate with your other body work and support your practice. So that's one thing that we want to touch on today, sort of taking us into the senior horse care, because a lot of us, when we're body workers, we're working on seniors and we're helping with maintenance on a number of levels in that way. And so we want to talk about what that looks like and, some of the aspects of that as we go. And we'll see how far we get. We may start to embark a little bit on pelvis and sacrum at the end of the podcast, but just know that our next podcast is going to dive really deep into the anatomy, physiology, biomechanics of the pelvic and sacrum area. So something to look forward to. Awesome. Okay, Elisse, here we go.
So we're going to start talking about senior horse care to kick it off, because it's a nice lead in. And I think so many of us either have a senior, as Alexa said, or will be heading into senior land at some point. And I was gifted from the universe a lot of experience in senior horse care, just that my herd is all over the age of 20. I did have one member reaching 42, as some of you know. So I do have a lot of experience, and there were some things that I came to notice in my experiences with my own herd. And one thing that you guys may not know about me is that one of my very first jobs when I was a kinesiologist, as I worked in a long-term care facility for humans. And I did that job for about 3 or 4 years. And my role in that team was working with the physio and doing their exercise rehab programs, as well as cognitive remediation exercises with all of the seniors in the care home. And I didn't know it at the time, but the principles that I learned working with those seniors really have come to light when I'm working with my own horse seniors. Some of those sort of primary needs came to the forefront of the enrichment pieces and how important it is to keep physically moving. So maintaining mobility well into senior life is so important. And that's what I was paid to do at the long-term care facility, was help them move and help them get through their exercises and to provide enriching activities. So I hope you can see how wonderful the parallels are when we can apply that same understanding with our horses. Because they too are aging just like us. And they go through significant changes as well, both mentally and physically, but it is often overlooked, I find.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you that know, Diva's turning 25 next year. So this topic is also near and dear to my heart. And I know that for many of us, there's I don't know, I want to call it a myth that, after a certain age, horses can't really their lives sort of go downhill. I think we have that with humans as well in some ways, right? I think that today I would love to start to unpack this, because Elisse has, when I work with her herd, for example, this summer I came over and I was there for the whole horse apprenticeship retreat, and then again for our cranial level 1 course. And there was one mare in the herd, and I was quite certain that she was, this is China. I was quite certain that she was like 12 or 13. And I never bothered to ask how old she was. And then later on, I saw a post and it said she was 25. And I was like, okay, what are we doing here? So Elise's place, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your setup, Elisse. So, because I think that I get super inspired, number one, but also anybody that I see walk into your space is like, what is happening? And just share a little bit more about your herd and ages and all of that.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. My space. So my space it's a continuous work in progress, right? Yeah. So it's never fully complete because there's always something more, something new coming up that I want to add. But I'll go back to how I got this space and why is that, I had found myself in a position with 4 senior horses and we were needing a new home. And at that time, I was deep into the study of how can I maintain these horses' quality of life? How can I actually help them to thrive, not just survive? Because of what you mentioned, just the myths that are so perpetuated. I feel that a horse who is no longer able to compete no longer holds some sort of physical value anymore. So that really bothered me, and it's simply untrue, especially in the human world. There's plenty of over-aged 40 athletes that are competing and living very functional lives, myself included. So it was something that I was like, listen, we have to figure out how to promote longevity in these horses. So that put me on the quest, and I met you through a lot of those venues of discovering how I can do this. And what it came down to was understanding that it's not that different than us, is that horses and humans, what we need to thrive well into our older years is maintaining mobility, right? So we know that we need to be able to keep moving. We need to be able to be engaging in functional activities that are going to maintain our joints, maintain our muscles, maintain our digestive systems. Obviously, diet as well is playing a key role there for us and them. And then there was these enrichment pieces that one of the things that I learned at the long-term care center, and it was really sad at the time in speaking with so many different seniors, and asking them about their lives. And what was consistently brought to me was that they were deeply depressed about the lack of enriching activities that was available to them anymore because of their physical limitations. So, obviously they were not able to go out as much. They're not able to engage in all the activities they used to love doing. And that really took a toll on them. And it did make me think of our horses and how so often we hear of horses being retired and just sort of, oh, he's out living his best life. And like, yes, well, that's true that they are turned out and there's less demands. It's not always that enriching, right? And there's not that sort of neurophysiological piece of cognitive sort of engagement, right? So that was big for me too, is how can I create a space that is enriching, that is fun and functional to a horse's body? So when I came to see my property, it was not a track. It was a pretty simple sort of traditional setup horse property. It had the stalls and the barn in the back, a riding arena that was separate, and then a front yard, I would call it, like a large sort of grassy area that was fenced. And when I saw that, I started researching track systems and how can I do this? And what I learned is it's pretty easy. It takes a little bit of creativity, right? And a little bit of planning. But what I was able to do was to essentially build a circular section in the front part of that grassy yard, we'll call it. And that facilitated a track around. And then what I was able to do as well was make a few alterations to that sort of traditional setup in the back, wherein the track as well encapsulated the entire barn. Then it came to adding enriching areas. So I did get some sort of different footings brought in the beginning stages, but I did learn that not all of them fare well in rain. Mm-hmm. So it's ever changing learning, but yeah, introducing different footings because I was understanding how the various types of terrain that the horse's bodies are able to move over promotes different benefits within the hoof as well as within the rest of the body because of the varied surfaces that the horse can move over. Then as the place progressed, I realized that I still needed some more sort of browsing activities. And if you're not familiar with browsing, that's if you watch horses in the wild, you'll notice that they don't necessarily eat from one position. They'll frequently eat leaves off trees, so their heads are up in the air. They'll eat barks and different types of twigs and sticks. They'll also, of course, graze down at the ground. So I tried to figure out how I could replicate that. And I looked to my neighbor's forest yard. They had a big forest in there. And I thought, well, that would be a really great area as well. So I approached the neighbors and asked to be able to fence off parts of their forest to connect it to our track, which is how you now see my track. It's one connected sort of entity with a separate forest section that is part of it. And that really, really changed things for us because once the horses had access to the forest, they were engaging in all types of behaviors I'd really not seen out of them because they didn't have access to trees and that type of footing and the browsing opportunities of the different herbs and plant varietals in there. So that was a huge piece too into how we sort of built this really cool place. Now, where would you like me to go from here?
Well, I love, so one of the things that I love, so Elisse's barn used to be sort of, I think, more of a classic in and out structure. And then there was a ring. The ring is also included in the track, which is fantastic, as well as constantly available sort of obstacles. So she's got a pedestal, she's got a bridge, she's got steps, she's got, various things that can be utilized by the horses. A nice, the really easy one on this, like that Elisse and I were talking about at apprenticeship retreat, is just 2 pallets, plywood, and all drilled together with a nice non-slip surface on the top. You would be amazed how much your horses utilize that for relieving pressure on the front end and
spinal, like lumbar,
spinal relief. Diva is always up. I just have a 1 level pallet, and she's like, when I come to feed them in the morning, she's got her feet up on there. And I've also got a massive tractor tire that's probably 2 feet up. And Raven is always on there, loves it, getting up on there and standing, and just she'll stay up there for 5-10 minutes at a time, just of her own volition. So these are other pieces. And the other thing I loved, Elisse sent me a video, was how she's actually opened up the causeway of her barn and opened all the dividers of the stalls up, so that the horses don't get stuck in any corners, but that they have all this indoor space that they can go in on. It's really pouring rain today. On a day like this, they could go inside, have their naps, and all be able to share inside space, which I just thought was so brilliant, considering a lot of us have these sort of there's a pretty sort of common way of having barns around here. There's sort of like this really nice change in perspective of, oh, like this is a thing that we can do.
And that's why I said it takes some creativity, because I did have a traditional setup. You'd walk in, there was 4 sort of box stalls on the right. And by opening up those box stalls, as well as parts of the barn aisle and fencing those off, we've made sort of like this flowy circular mini track, which is an indoor mini track within the track. And keeping in mind what Alexa said is just not having those corners and creating like big sort of dumpy out areas and then causeways. Yeah. And that has really changed the amount of circulation that they're doing. Now, another piece that I just thought of while you're talking is that one of the ways that I promote that movement and mobility is by strategic placement of nets and hay, right? So we put resources all over the place on the property. In the summer, it's like anywhere goes. We do free hay up in the front and back of the forest, all different spots, so that they're constantly seeking the different spots of the hay, circulating around the property. And I know when we first moved in, I did do the test of putting a pedometer on Sparky, because I was so curious how much more movement he was getting. So at my old place, we had a 2-acre field, but it was just a box. And I thought that was great at the time because it was a lot of free space. But when I moved here, this place is also just over 2 acres. But because of the different shape and the ability to track it, I was like, well, let's just see how many more steps that he's going to get in. And I was blown away. So that first 24 hours, Sparky got over 12 kilometers worth of steps in on the same 2-acre sort of piece of land that previously he was hitting maybe 1 to 2K on a good day.
That gives me goosebumps.
Yeah. So it's like, that was just like the writing on the wall for me of like, this is why I need to do this, because Sparky was already hitting his 40s at that time. And so to be covering that amount of mileage every single day, just through daily activities of living, like getting hay and getting water, it was just phenomenal. Right. And now, of course, everyone's on this track because I'm all about the track system. I'll never go back. No. From a caretaking perspective, it's also been life-changing. Coming from traditional setup as well, myself, or growing up in that way, and cleaning the stalls one by one and picking them and filling them and this and that, versus just letting them be out all the time. Like my workload, it's gone down in that way, because they don't ever run out of hay. They're on free flow hay. So there's no longer this mad rush to get out in the morning and feed them. There's no longer any panic about certain meal times or anyone running out of food. They simply don't run out of hay. And they have numerous stations to choose from. So that back to that flow piece, right? That we have 6 right now in our herd. And when you've got the different stations about, and I do recommend definitely having at least 2 more stations than number of horses. So I'm overboard with this. I have 12 stations for 6 horses because I really, really want them to be circulating, and I want everybody to always have access to food, no matter what's going on in the herd, as well as shelters, right? So always 2 more plus shelters to horses. But those are the pieces that really promote the 24/7 sort of like meandering movement, right? Which over the long term, and this is well proven in human studies, is what promotes the development of osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, reduces digestive issues, right? So keeping your body moving has so many health benefits. It's innumerable. So that's why, yeah, that piece of having the track is, yes, it's one thing to have the track, but also you need to get creative and figure out how can I stimulate natural inherent movement in them, not chasing them around, but actually creating situations where they want to seek and find and move.
Yeah. Well, and I'm always amazed by your crew because they move a lot and they move fast, and these are like we're talking now, Waco's what, 29?
No, Thunder's
No, Thunder's 29,
29,
Waco's
37.
37. Okay, so guys, this is, and Waco is a going concern. If you've seen any of Elise's videos
he's
of him,
constantly the star of the videos because he's
really
always the little dude that's ripping around
and he's getting everybody
chasing all the
going.
youngsters.
And I think, I've really been thinking so much about enrichment lately, and realistically, I can't come up with better enrichment than them having buddies. Because honestly, it's a constantly changing landscape, and it's constantly interesting to have, the constellation occurring of a herd dynamic, and it's natural that way. So I think it's just so, yeah, it's so neat. Like I know for myself, I just have my two girls on our track. And Raven has been, she was diagnosed with early onset of arthritis, as you know, when she was like 4 years old. And she's totally sound on our track, like sound at a trot, both reins, happy gal, right? Just with the movement.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's huge for her. So, yeah, so there you go. But I want to take this conversation because I love how you talk about circulating and flow, because let's take that down into the micro, right? So here we are talking about that in the macro and how important that is. And let's take it down to the micro in terms of fluids, in terms of, here we can start to bridge over to the cranial work. This is a huge part of why we do, why I do osteopathy, craniosacral therapy, other forms of body work. A big part of it is fluid movement within the body. Yeah.
Isn't it so interesting too when we can take a guiding principle like that and see that it's applying at the micro level as well?
Yeah.
I think that's why we both love cranio, because the correlations are abundant, right? And it's definitely such a cool concept that we're going to get into today, because we just kicked it off with the track system talk.
Totally. I love seeing that parallel. I love seeing that parallel. So one of the things that we talk, so in osteopathy, what we talk about principles of osteopathy, and one of the big ones is something we call the rule of the artery. You may have heard of this before, you may not have. Either way, totally cool. Essentially, the rule of the artery is like it sounds. It means that the health and the free-flowing transit of our vessels, meaning nerve, blood, and lymph, is utterly a priority to our health. So critical to our overall health, vitality, and general, with these seniors, for example, keeping those vessels open, flowing, moving well is going to majorly increase their ability to be resilient, to be well, essentially. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is what we're going to talk about today, is some more into the rule of the artery and why it's so critical for everyone.
It's a rule.
Why it's a rule. Yeah. So anything you want to say on that to start us off, Elise?
Yeah, well, I love this rule because it just makes so much sense. That's all I can say is when I learned these principles in osteopathy, I was like, finally, this is making sense. And it's giving me this important understanding of these hierarchical sort of classifications within the body, and giving me a sense of direction when it came to treatment and assessment. So the rule of the artery is a big one because, as Alexa said, we're talking about, it is called rule of the artery, but also sometimes referred to as rule of the tube.
Yep.
It's any sort of vessel that a fluid is traveling through. Now, fluids are life, right? without fluids, without blood, we would cease to be. So it is really up there in priority. Without cerebrospinal fluid, we would also cease to have healthy functional nervous system. And the nervous system is quite important. So we really take it critically important, right, in osteopathy, because we understand that every single other structure in our body requires these vital fluids to function. Now, if any one of these vessels is perturbed or compressed or tractions or has something that's going to impede the flow of any of those fluids, it is clear and obvious that whatever those vessels are feeding will not be receiving the fluid that was needed to get there, right? And then we start to see a whole host of other orthopedically sort of inclined conditions popping up, because everything in our body needs blood. Everything in our body also needs waste removal in terms of venous return. So veins taking away deoxygenated blood, we need that to go so that we can create space for new oxygenated blood, right? So there's all these critical functions that are occurring based on those fluids getting to their destination.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we both have probably hundreds of examples of this. One of the ones I thought about was with Raven when she came into my life. I of course went into this like, why does she have this condition so early on? Why is this hoof very misshapen and this leg like, not doing the same as the rest of her body, and realizing, rule of the artery, right? Raven had and needs maintenance on her sternum through her brachial plexus, right? I don't know if she had an accident or something, but when I got her, her sternum was very, very shifted in not great ways. And that can cause impingement, not just of nerves, but of very vital blood vessels. And I was telling Elise before this, I went to the nerve tour with Jill Headley, which is kind of the talk of the town right now. If you can go see it, do go see it. It may be coming to a place near you. But one of the things that was so interesting is that every nerve had a related vein or artery. They just lived together.
They travel
together, right? And so we're not talking about, I mean, yes, they're kind of separate structures, but they're together in the body. The heart and the brain work together all the way through the body. So for Raven, any nerve impingement down that leg would also be a compression of an artery, a vein, a change in blood flow and circulation, an inability to take away waste product. All those things would be happening in that leg. So we want to think of that rule of the artery whenever we're thinking about any kind of health issue, vitality issue. It's like, okay, what's happening here with the tubes? What's happening with the tubes? Mm-hmm.
Well, and I love that because, I mean, from a studying perspective or a student mind perspective, it's actually really exciting because you go, okay, well, if I can just learn the nerves then, the pathways, half of my studying's done because I know that an artery and a vein is going to be traveling with that as well, right?
And typically
so
they're named.
One.
Yeah.
And that understanding all on its own was really life-changing for me because I already did know many of the nerve pathways for the human. I'm like, oh, well, now I can see why this is going together. I was thinking while you're talking to is to give the listeners sort of like a basic human example of this in action, or the role of the artery in action, is we've probably all woken up at some time or another with what happens. We sleep on our outstretched arm. We put our head on our elbow. We go to sleep and we wake up and we can't feel our arm, right? And then we start to get pins and needles, sometimes shooting pain as we feel sensations coming back into the arm and hand. So that is on a very small scale, and temporary scale is the rule of the artery being perturbed, right? So we went to sleep, we created compression on our arm when we put our head there. We then compressed that vessel for, who knows, 6 hours or so or more. And you wake up and you can't feel your arm because those fluids and those neural impulses were not going through the compressed site. Now that's a temporary compression because when we raise our head up and we start to shake our arm out as we do, like, my arm is hurting or I can't feel it. Then we start to stimulate the rule of the tube and everything starts moving again through. And luckily, in temporary situations, it's recoverable, right? We get our sensation back. Everything feels fine once we're up and moving again. But when we think about long-term compressions that arise for many reasons, but the most common ones being injury. Okay, so something external has occurred to the body. We now have a compression site due to injury. Then we start to get long-term rule of the tube or rule of the artery compressive factors occurring. There's other internal factors that can create compressions, which is shifts in our own internal anatomy, again, due to many different factors, injury or disease or et cetera, et cetera. So it starts to build that picture for you how, yes, when your arm falls asleep, that's a compression. But what if we were to stay falling asleep on our arm for 20 years, right? How much fluid did not get through that region? We would probably start to see major atrophy in the tissues, meaning shrinkage of some of the major tissues. And we would start to see long-term dysfunction. So losses of motor control to the region, losses of innervation, losses of sensation, right? Because of those neural tissues not receiving that fluid to work. So hopefully that helps to sort of
absolutely. And I think a big one there too, when it comes to horses, because they're nonverbal as such, is pain. So when we hear something, I'm going to say something very controversial, I'm sure, but when we hear something like, "Oh, we've ruled out pain," both Elisse and I are making eyes at each other.
I'm taking a deep breath. I'm getting upset.
You can't rule out pain when it comes to this kind of compressive injury. So if a big part of how humans, so say I have a disc bulge, so I can use my personal example, right? I come into the office and I say, I can't feel my right leg. I have burning pain down my gluteal and down my calf, and I'm getting tingling in my toes. And I have burning pain across my back, right? So I, as a human, can report these particular
very specific
sensations of what I'm experiencing. Oh, I can't go into flexion, it hurts, all these things. Well, for our horses, they can't do that. They can report it to us through behavior, potentially through changes in their activity. Maybe they slow down. They don't want to walk out to that place anymore. Maybe they, like Raven, didn't want to have her girth on anymore because she had a nerve impingement, and having compression in that area was very painful for her. So there's all these pieces that they try to give us information. Maybe they just shut down and go, okay, maybe if I do that, I won't feel this anymore. So I think it's really important, especially with our senior horses, with all horses, to recognize that we're not always going to see some specific symptom necessarily in these kind of situations. And it's not going to necessarily show up on even on imaging about what's occurring, because you're not going to really see like, oh, well, this artery has just this little pressure on it, or this vein, it's not going to come up that way. And so
peripheral nerve entrapments are amongst the hardest to diagnose in humans as well, because there is no imaging that's super specific or reliable, right? Like in terms of, is this nerve compressed? Yes, ultrasounds may catch it. It may not, depending on where the compression is. X-rays definitely will not capture that, right? So it's, even in human land, these are extremely challenging to diagnose and extremely painful.
Yep.
So I do love, I've calmed down. I've loved that we can never rule out pain fully. So I would like to take that off the table. It's hard. I've had a lot of course, horse owners over my time say, well, we've ruled out pain as an option. And my response is, well, we can't ever really fully rule that out, right? That's always on the table of possibility, because same as humans, we just can't ever know exactly what's going on. We're just doing our best to make clinically informed decisions.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I was wanting to share, because I found this fascinating. So I see this mainly in my human clients, because I'm mainly working with humans right now, but it's because the rule of the artery is absolute, that means the body will prioritize the health of the vessels. So let's take that walking for a sec. So what that means is, say as a body worker, you're like, oh my gosh, they're whatever, pectorals or they're
Traps.
traps or whatever. They're so tight. They're always tight. I have to work on these every single time I come out to see this horse. Like that's a moment where you need to step on back and go, okay, why?
Yeah.
Why?
That's your aha moment. Right? You keep doing the same thing over and over and you expect a different result. You need to ask yourself, why am I continuing to do the same thing and nothing's changing? Why do I keep doing it?
Yeah, because what will happen oftentimes in the body is it goes into a brace pattern to protect the vessels. The vessels are king in the body, right? Like the back will protect the spinal cord, like, all these things. So I see it most often, and maybe this will track back to the cranial work too. Well, probably at the cranial base, because the cranial base is a veritable highway for large, important vessels, right? So we've got our spinal cord, we've got our jugular vein, we've got our carotid artery, we've got our vagus nerve, we've got all these things. I'm not even going into like the smaller arteries, like vertebral artery, so many things going through esophagus, trachea, all very important. And the body will protect. So if the cranial base is not moving, what I often see in my human clients is the thorax is not moving either.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So the body goes, yep, no, just shut her down.
Yeah.
And as soon as the cranial base opens up, oh, lo and behold, the thorax moves, right? Because those vessels now have freedom. They're not being compressed, impinged, or tractioned. And the thorax now feels it's okay to move and shift and be mobile again, right? Yeah.
And this is like another example is just that those patients, if you're a human therapist or clients, horse therapist, where you consistently see the same spinal pattern, right? So you go and, their T-spine is always like stuck down in extension and rotated one way. And you do a bunch of stuff to release it. And it does release in the moment. And then you come back a couple weeks later and it's right back in that same spinal pattern, right? So that's another aha moment for you to say, what is the body protecting? Or why is it going back into this bracing pattern? Because there is a reason, right? The body's always wanting homeostasis. That is another principle that we can get into another day, but there is a homeostatic component to everything in our body. It's constantly trying to keep us at balance, right? Mm-hmm. The body doesn't go into these strange patterns for no reason, right? It doesn't just happen. I don't know how to say that. There's always a reason that there are these sort of presentations. So another thing too is like looking at the joints and the bones. And when you see those patterns arising over and over and over, you might now, I hope, after listening to this, start thinking about the rule of the artery and thinking, okay, is it possible that the body is protecting something else? And that my releasing everything around it is quite possibly compounding that in a negative way, because you're removing a stability brace that's been put in by the nervous system for a reason.
Yeah. And I think we make our work a lot harder oftentimes, and maybe a little less like rewarding as well, because we're sort of banging our head against a bit of a wall when we're treating that way at times, right?
Well, hey, I'm a humble, I'll be honest, I banged my head against a wall for 10, 15 years before I went and got this understanding through osteopathy, right? So I was that therapist, but I was doing the best that I could with the education and tools that I had at that time, right? And that's all it is. But now when you get to the other side of it and you're like, oh, well, this is making more sense now. And I'm actually seeing results in that when I can assess and utilize the rule of the artery understanding and work towards freeing up that, whatever that may be, then I find that I don't need to do any massage or myofascial work around those segments, because the body homeostatically will return to natural balance when that lesion is removed.
Oh, I remember you sent me one like before. Elisse is just amazing at doing before and after photos, and I swear to God, I've never done it. It's so bad. Yeah. And she sent me one photo and it was she said, I just worked with the fluids.
Yeah.
And
that was a good one.
Incredible. Like, I swear to God, it was like photo, I think, of the hind end.
And the side view I took for
and a
him.
side view, and the hind end literally looks like someone like a balloon that somebody blew up. Like
Mhm.
it just had all this fullness and like this softness. Like literally, I think what this was in a like just one treatment kind of
One
thing.
treatment, yeah.
And it was like another horse.
And this,
And
yeah, that's why I shared that because I don't think that people always think about how critical these fluids are and how much like they fill up the space when they're present and vital.
yeah,
So what I think I labeled that one was like what looks like a weight problem because the horse looked very underweight.
yeah, I
Okay?
bet.
Like upon first meeting, he looked almost underweight, very bony, and the tissue was very dehydrated looking, like very rigid and kind of stuck onto the bones. Following this session, it actually looked like he'd gained about 100 pounds
Mm,
within an hour, which is obviously not possible, right? So that was the point of the post is this horse obviously didn't put on 100 pounds of weight within one day. So what could account for this change in what looks like body composition is that the areas are filled with blood again, and the areas are having waste products removed, right? So there's actually circulation in and out of the region, which looks like what Alexa said, a nice full, plump, juicy musculature, right? But the reality is that musculature was there in the first place. It just didn't have any fluids feeding it.
yeah.
So that one, I did love sharing that because that's just fluidic work. That's the only thing that I did was fluidic work and seeking to find those sort of primary compressive areas for him and
Yeah.
working only those that day.
I love it. So I wanted to chat more about the specific areas of work. So one that I think is very, very worthwhile mentioning is what we call the three diaphragms because of their role in fluid. So oftentimes we think of having one diaphragm, the thoracic diaphragm. That's kind of the one that gets all the acclaim. Um, and very, very vital structure. Absolutely love the thoracic diaphragm. But it is very important to also note that we have two other major diaphragms and a number of smaller diaphragms as well in the body. The main role of these diaphragms is around pressure regulation, but also around each one of them have many vessels moving through them. And so they're very much monitoring pressure, yes, and fluid flow, which can debatably be a very similar, if not the same thing. But so we want to talk about these diaphragms. So the other two diaphragms, we're talking about what we call the cranial diaphragm, which is made up of the specifically the dural membranes, but arguably all the spinal membranes at the cranial base, at the tentorium, and then also down in the pelvis at the pelvic floor, made up of the pelvic floor musculature there. Okay, so ideally, in the most ideal situation in a body, all these diaphragms are functioning in a healthy way and are actually synchronized in their movement together, which is always an amazing thing to feel. Not very common, though, I would say. Yes. Yes. So we want to look at all the ways that these diaphragms are functioning and how healthy and happy they are and how easily they're allowing fluid to move. So perhaps we want to come back to the thoracic diaphragm as an example of this because the thoracic diaphragm has the passages for the esophagus, and as well as the abdominal aorta, the inferior vena cava, the vagus nerve,
Yeah.
a lot of things,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah. So let's, yeah. Do you have some thoughts to share on the thoracic diaphragms?
Where do I go from here? There's many thoughts to share on the thoracic diaphragm in terms of our rule of the artery. Yeah. So as Alexa just said, there's a ton of vessels. And vessels include veins, arteries, nerves traveling through, like actually piercing through the dome of the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is there for many critical functions. Primarily, you guys will sort of recognize it as like our breathing muscle, which is one of its many functions. So the diaphragm is assisting us in breathing. So as we inhale, our diaphragm is going to move down, kind of sort of assisting our organs downward to create space above for the lungs to fill up with air. So it's part of that breathing mechanism. The diaphragm is also responsible for the pumping of our digestive contents. So in movement, same for horses, that's really important. And as Alexa just touched on, is responsible for regulating balance and pressure between the different cavities. So it helps with balancing pressure above it and below it at the pelvic diaphragm.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if we get, now that you're understanding, any sort of compression or stasis to one of the vessels traveling through the diaphragm, right? What can be the effects of that? And also, why would a diaphragm become rigid and potentially be the site of compression for one of those vessels?
Oh, so many things.
There's so many, right? But maybe just thinking on that, leaving you with some questions to think about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many things to think about there. I mean, and you could go to all sorts of levels because guess where the saddle sits even, right? So it's interesting stuff like this where, is your horse breathing well? And how is that diaphragm moving? It's quite a study. Yeah.
Yeah, so many widespread effects because of the breathing itself being a critical function to sustain life. What's the purpose of breathing? It helps us get oxygen in, and every single tissue in our body requires oxygen to function, right? So we want oxygenated blood. So that's a whole rabbit hole that we could go down perhaps another episode, but
Yes.
there's so many critical functions occurring, and then bringing it back to what we're talking about today with our rule of the tube and just sort of starting to understand how this fits into that big picture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's huge. I wanted to share. I shared this, I think, at our cranial course, but it was like one of my most vivid examples of the rule of the tube in the cranial base specifically. We were working with I was working with, I think it was about 33-year-old horse, and he started to not be able to get up. So he would lay down and then not have the strength to get up. And so he'd gotten stuck a couple of times down. And at one point they'd had a tractor get him up. It became quite a thing. When I came out, I realized that the cranial base was, so he did not have what we call PRM, which is the primary respiratory mechanism globally. So his global vitality was almost non-existent. At this point, I could almost push him over with one finger at the hind end. He was so wobbly in his hind end, and I could lift up his tail like as far as I wanted to go. There was absolutely no holding reflex or muscle action in his tail. And I, of course, feeling that went, oh my gosh, this doesn't feel good. So I tried out the 2 vitality techniques that Elisse and I offer in our cranial course, our Cranial 1 course. And actually, we'll be sharing a little bit more about how you can receive those techniques earlier on as well. But they work very well in tandem, and they basically open up the venous sinuses in the cranium so that things can flow, right? So I thought, okay, we're going to give it a go. And it was one of those moments. So I did both. I started to feel the PRM come back in the occipital bone, in the frontal bones, in the sphenoid. And I thought, okay, we'll go check this out. So once that came back online and I've done some listening and I've sort of done some integration around it, I went back to the hind end, and lo and behold, could no longer push him over with one finger. And he was swishing his tail. He actually had vitality back down the spine. Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And that was maybe 3 minutes after the technique kind of.
Well, and this is the thing, right? Like when fluids are restricted and then not, it's instant, right? It's not like we'll see what happens in a few weeks. It's like, no, it's pretty instant on the spot, because the fluid is going to flow. It's movement of fluid right through instantly to the area. And you're going to see those results. If you know what you're looking for, it's going to be there to be seen and felt, right? Through your hands.
Yeah. It was so cool. And I just thought as well at that time, like how critical vitality is. So this is one thing we wanted to get into today as well, because I think it can be a little bit of an overlooked. I know it was for me as a body worker for years, because I didn't know really how to check this. But I do recall Dave Collins, when I was in the BC College of Equine Therapy forever ago, he did this experiment, which maybe I told you about, where with the metopic suture technique, he would get us to go into like a sit-up position.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so like you kind of like in a V, and then get someone to try to push you down.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning, I mean, like I went down just like a little leaf, like, doop, like, and then someone did the metopic suture on me. And then they did it again. And it was like magic. I was so strong.
Yeah.
And it stuck in my brain after that point. I was like, oh my gosh, this is what happens in the body. It provides this vitality in the system where it gives fluids, it like wakes everything up. And yeah, so I just found that such a good image.
Yeah, you know, I know you reminded me, this was something I took one of my continuing eds like a long time ago. They did a similar test with using our arm strength. So holding your arm out to 90 and then your partner tries to push it down, it drops down, or, you know, you can't sustain it. And then we did diaphragmatic sort of like resisted breathing for about 10 to 15 reps. You're basically getting like diaphragmatic pumping online and activated and sort of cooperating more with your brain and everything. And retest, and nobody could move the arm, right? And that's just exactly what you're saying, is just like the opening up of fluid, the activation of these regions, again, that were previously sort of dormant, and then getting things moving, right? And you get an instant result, which equals, oh my God, I'm actually feeling stronger, because not because I gained muscle strength in 2 seconds, but because those tissues are getting the nutrients that they need in the moment to be able to fire and activate, right? So yeah, it's really cool once you start getting into this work and starting to see the correlation with what we're talking about, vitality. Now, I think for myself, vitality was something I didn't understand well at all in the beginning. And I always kind of glazed over it when I would hear that. And what do they mean by that? Like, yeah, I'm vital, right? But no, I understand it so much better now because of the osteopathy, and recognizing that when you have vitality issues, it's a much bigger problem than these individual little orthopedic issues, because vitality is what keeps us alive. It's like life force, right? Like our level of vitality is a really good indicator of the health of the entire system, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, this is why we spend a lot of time in our cranial trainings teaching on what is vitality, how do we measure it, like giving it a measurable parameter that we can identify it, and also identify when there isn't vitality in certain areas, because it does trump other things. It's more important, because life force is more important than, you know, a singular joint that's a little bit stiff. So we need those fluids first everywhere before we need to focus in on individual problems.
Yeah.
More vitality.
I love vitality work. So in osteopathy, it is the most primary lesion, essentially, most primary thing, because especially global vitality. So this means like this horse that I was telling you about, where he's had a loss of vitality overall throughout the body. Why it's a huge priority? I mean, fairly obviously, any tissue that you treat when he's in that condition, it doesn't actually have the energy to hold any change, right? So you could treat till the cow comes home, and you actually are depleting the system a little bit more oftentimes, because it has to try to work with the things that are coming in, right? And it doesn't have the energy for it. But two, you're pouring into like a bottomless well, I guess, in a way, right? So we kind of got to build the well first, and then it has the capacity to actually utilize what you are adding into the system in good ways, in powerful ways. Yeah. So I love that this is something that we teach like right away in our first level 1 cranial, because of that, because we want to help people to build that vitality first. It's that first building block of anything else as far as treatment. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think that it's time. We wanted to chat today. One of the reasons we are doing this podcast right now is because we have a level 1 intake coming up we're doing once yearly now. So for January 1st. So it is open for registration right now. The course content is available January 1st for our online program. And it also, so it can be either a purely CE, continuing education, just in the online format, or you can actually, which I would recommend, I think Elise would recommend, do the whole enchilada for the certification, which includes the online portion as well as a 5-day live practicum. And that is opening up now for equine and human body workers who have some past education. So we do require a prerequisite for entering that program. But yeah. You want to share a little bit more about it, Elise?
About our programs?
Yeah.
No, that was good. I'm just excited to start getting our next intake going. We've just finished up with our last cohort and it was a great year. Yeah, just being a full certification program now has sort of been our dream since the beginning of our creation of this. And I'm still just as passionate as I was at the first day that we created this, because just now seeing everybody else going into the world and understanding horses on these levels, right? And being able to offer them really potent tools is essentially like, having that toolkit expanded and that awareness understanding expanded has been so cool to watch others now getting that and adding to their practice. Cause I just remember being, so frustrated before I had this knowledge of just feeling really like hitting a lot of roadblocks all the time. Right. Yeah. And I don't feel that way anymore because of this. It's opened up my understanding in such a broader global way. Right.
Yeah.
So
no,
I don't have anything to add. I'm looking forward to the upcoming year and more people coming to learn with us.
Yeah, me too. So if you are interested, I'm going to post an outro after this with more information as well on a webinar that will be coming available. And also some of the links as well. But Elise, will you share your website with everybody?
Yes, our information page can be found on my website, and it is a very long domain name. Hindsight is 2020 when you the website. So it's www.equilibria, so EQUILIBRIA therapeutics.com/get certified. And you can check out our details on our cranio certs that are coming up. And in there, you'll see Alexa's filmed some nice little sort of like introductory videos to show you what's inside. So take you behind the scenes into our online learning platform, and you can get a little bit more detail on what the live practicum entails, etc.
Awesome. So yeah, it's an application only. So you can go there to apply. And yeah, as I say, I'll have more information if you keep listening about our upcoming webinar and Q&A. And yeah, really appreciate you being here today, Elise.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am so excited to continue on our series.
Yeah.
For all the geeks out there, because I know I've had a lot of people reach out when we first did our original Geek Out.
Yes.
It was 2020.
Totally.
That we're not alone. I think there are a lot of people that do enjoy that level of anatomy. So it's just sort of like a dream come true to be able to have somebody else who wants to do this with me.
Completely. And I just had a thought as well. If anybody has brilliant plans or anything that they really, really would love to see us cover in one of these geek outs, please be sure to message me either by email, alexa@alexalinton.com, or you can get in touch with me over social media. And yeah, let us know what you'd like
that's
to
awesome.
learn
Give us
about.
a topic and we'll see what we can do.
Oh yeah, we will geek out for you. Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in today. I hope you learned a thing or two. And thanks, Elise, again. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
If you're interested in learning more about equine cranial therapy from Elise and I, we now have an introductory webinar available. I had hinted at it in the podcast, and you can sign up for that at bit.ly/CST webinar. So that's bit.ly/CST webinar to get that. really cool replay and be signed up for our live Q&A. In that, you get 2 amazing techniques as well to start your journey in cranial therapy. And if you are interested in learning more about our certification, you can head to equilibriatherapeutics.com/equine-craniosacral. So we hope to see you there. You can apply today. Our intake begins January the 1st, but you can apply anytime, and this intake closes January 31st. Okay, have a great day.